October 17th, 1929. 6 a.m. A bloodied figure stumbles across the desolate sands of Huguenot Beach on Staten Island. His face is a crimson mask, his throat slashed from ear to ear, his back perforated with knife wounds. Officer Henry Blank pulls his Ford patrol car to a stop and watches the man stagger forward, one hand pressed against wounds that should have killed him hours ago. When Blanca asks what happened, the man's response is barely a whisper through swollen lips. I was taken for a ride. What happened in the hours before dawn didn't just earn Charles Lucania his legendary nickname. It didn't just give him the scars that would make his face one of the most recognizable in organized crime history. It revealed something far more dangerous than any weapon. It showed the underworld that this 32-year-old gangster possessed something his enemies would never understand until it was too late. And when you hear what he did in response, not with bullets or bombs, but with calculated intelligence that would reshape the American Mafia forever, you'll understand why Lucky Luciano became untouchable. To understand what happened that October morning, you need to understand the war that was tearing New York's underworld apart in 1929. Two Sicilian bosses were locked in a death struggle for control of the city's most lucrative rackets. Joe, the boss Masseria, controlled Lower Manhattan with an iron fist, running bootlegging operations that funneled millions through speakeasies from the Bowery to Broadway. On the other side stood Salvatore Maranzano, a calculating Sicilian traditionalist who saw himself as a Caesar of crime, determined to organize the city's gangs under old-world rules. Between them stood Charles Lucania, a 32-year-old Brooklyn-born gangster who worked for Masseria but was already thinking 3 moves ahead of both bosses. Luciano had grown up in the tenements of the Lower East Side, where he'd forged alliances that crossed ethnic lines. His closest associates included Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Jewish operators who shared his vision of crime as a business rather than a blood sport. While the old guard Sicilians were fighting over territory like medieval warlords, Luciano was building a network that would outlast them all. By 1929, Luciano had already survived the brutal streets that chewed up and spit out dozens of young gangsters every year. He'd earned his stripes running protection rackets, managing speakeasies, and moving narcotics through the port of New York. But the Castellammares War, as it would later be called, was forcing every gangster in the city to choose sides. And choosing sides in 1929 meant painting a target on your back. Masseria suspected everyone. Maranzano recruited through intimidation and old-world loyalty. And Luciano, caught between them, was valuable to both and trusted by neither. He was too modern for Maranzano's taste, too ambitious for Masseria's comfort. Someone was going to make a move on him. The only question was when. That when arrived on the evening of October 16th, 1929, when Luciano received a phone call that would change everything. October 16th, 1929. 10:45 p.m. Corner of 50th Street and 6th Avenue, Manhattan. Charles Luciano stood under a street lamp, his silk suit catching the amber glow of the city lights. He'd received a call earlier that evening. A woman's voice, smooth and familiar enough to get him to this corner, though something in his gut whispered wrong. The October air carried the smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor and the distant sound of jazz bleeding out of a speakeasy 2 blocks south. Traffic was light. Too light. Luciano reached into his coat for a cigarette when he heard it, the low rumble of an engine approaching too slowly. A dark sedan, a Packard maybe, rolled toward the intersection. No headlights. His hand moved from the cigarette toward the .38 tucked in his waistband, but he wasn't fast enough. The sedan lurched to a stop. 3 car doors swung open simultaneously. Men poured out, their faces obscured by pulled-down fedoras and upturned collars. Before Luciano could draw his weapon, cold steel pressed against his temple from behind. A 4th man had approached on foot, silent as smoke. "Don't move, Charlie," a voice growled. The accent was thick, Sicilian, but the face remained hidden. "You boys got the wrong guy," Luciano said, his voice steady despite the gun barrel digging into his skull. "Get in the car." When Luciano hesitated, 2 men grabbed his arms with professional efficiency. A fist drove into his kidney, buckling his knees. They dragged him toward the open car door while a 5th man kept watch, scanning the street for witnesses. There were none. The corner of 50th and 6th might as well have been in the middle of nowhere. They threw him into the back seat. His face hit the leather hard enough to split his lip. Hands yanked his arms behind him, winding rope around his wrists with practiced speed. Someone slapped adhesive tape across his mouth, cutting off his breath through his nose momentarily until he learned to control his panic. Then they shoved him to the floor between the seats, and heavy shoes pinned him down. The sedan pulled away into the night, and Charles Luciano disappeared into the darkness. The first blow came before they'd even left Manhattan. A boot to the ribs, then another. Luciano tried to curl into a defensive position, but the cramped space between the seats gave him nowhere to go. Above him, he could hear them talking in rapid Sicilian, their voices calm, almost businesslike. This wasn't rage. This was work. "You think you're smart, Charlie?" one of them said, switching to English. "You think you can play both sides?" Another kick, this one to his lower back. Pain exploded up his spine. The car turned sharply, and Luciano felt the change in the road surface. They were on a bridge now, the tires humming over steel grating. The Manhattan Bridge, most likely, heading toward Brooklyn. Or maybe they were going to dump him in the river. That's what he would do. Quick, clean, no body, no investigation. But they kept driving. Through Brooklyn, then across another bridge. The quality of the road changed again, rougher now. They were leaving the city. "Who sent you?" Luciano tried to say through the tape, but it came out as muffled noise. One of the men laughed. "He wants to talk." A hand reached down and ripped the tape from Luciano's mouth, taking skin with it. "I asked who sent you," Luciano repeated, tasting blood. "You really don't know?" The voice carried genuine surprise. "That's the problem with you, Charlie. You got so many enemies, you can't keep track." The beating continued. Fists rained down on his head, his back, his shoulders. Professional. Measured. They weren't trying to kill him yet. They were softening him up. Luciano had seen this before, done it before to men who owed money or talked to cops. The real work came later. Somewhere private. They drove for what felt like an hour, but might have been 20 minutes. Time distorted when you were eating leather and blood. Finally, the car slowed. The road beneath them turned to gravel, then dirt. When they stopped, the night was silent except for the distant sound of water. Ocean waves. They'd taken him to the coast. "Get him out!" Hands grabbed him, hauling him from the car like a sack of meat. His legs wouldn't hold him, and he fell to his knees on sandy soil. He could smell salt air and hear the crash of breakers somewhere close. A remote beach. Staten Island, maybe. Or the outer reaches of Brooklyn. A perfect place for a murder that would never be solved. The men formed a circle around him. In the moonlight, he could see them more clearly now. Thick-necked, cold-eyed professionals. Soldiers, not bosses. But whose soldiers? "You got one chance, Charlie," the tallest one said, producing a knife from inside his coat. The blade caught the moonlight, 8 inches of carbon steel. Tell us where Legs Diamond is hiding, and maybe you walk away from this. So that was it. They wanted Jack Legs Diamond, the Irish gangster who'd been dodging bullets and murder charges for months. Diamond and Luciano had worked together, run booze together, but that didn't mean Luciano knew where he was now. Diamond was smart enough to go to ground when things got hot. I don't know, Luciano said, and it was the truth. The knife man shook his head slowly. Wrong answer. What came next was butchery. The knife man stepped forward and drove his blade into Luciano's back, just below the shoulder blade. Luciano screamed, the sound ripping across the empty beach. The blade came out and went in again, lower this time. And again. And again. Luciano counted 4 stabs before his mind started to fog over, his body going into shock. Where is he? Another voice demanded. I don't know. Luciano gasped. They weren't satisfied. The knife moved to his throat, and he felt the cold steel slice across his neck. Not deep enough to hit the carotid, but deep enough that blood poured down his chest, hot and thick. His vision started to tunnel, darkness closing in from the edges. This was it. This was where Charlie Lucania died on a beach he didn't recognize, murdered by men he couldn't identify over information he didn't have. Forget it, one of them said. He don't know nothing. Leave him. You sure we should finish this? Look at him. He's dead already. Let's go. Luciano felt them walk away, heard car doors slam, heard the engine roar to life and fade into the distance. And then there was only silence, broken by the sound of waves and his own labored breathing. He lay there in the dirt and sand, blood pooling beneath him. The cold October air cutting through his shredded suit. His body screamed for him to close his eyes, to let the darkness take him. It would be easy, easier than fighting. But Charles Luciano didn't get to where he was by taking the easy way. He opened his eyes. The first thing Luciano did was inventory his body. His hands were still bound behind his back, but the rope had loosened during the beating. He twisted his wrists, ignoring the fresh waves of pain from the stab wounds in his back. The rope gave a little, then a little more. His fingers were slick with blood, which helped. After 5 minutes of silent agony, his hands came free. He rolled onto his side, then pushed himself up to his hands and knees. Blood dripped from his throat onto the sand. He could feel the wounds on his back, each one a point of white-hot pain that threatened to pull him back into unconsciousness. But he was alive. And if he was alive, he could move. Luciano got 1 foot under him, then the other. He stood, swaying like a drunk, his vision swimming. In the dim moonlight, he could see he was on a desolate stretch of beach lined with scrub brush and sand dunes. No houses, no lights, nothing but empty coastline stretching in both directions. He chose a direction and started walking. Each step was an exercise in willpower. His legs wanted to buckle, his body wanted to quit. But Luciano kept moving, 1 foot in front of the other, leaving a trail of blood droplets in the sand behind him. He didn't know it was Staten Island. He thought maybe they'd taken him to New Jersey, somewhere far enough from the city that his body might not be found for days, if ever. But he kept walking, because the alternative was lying down and dying. And Charlie Luciano wasn't ready to die. The beach gave way to scrub grass and then to a dirt road. He followed the road, stumbling forward, using trees and fence posts to steady himself when his vision blurred. How long he walked, he couldn't say. Time had become meaningless. There was only the next step, and the next, and the next, then headlights. A car was coming toward him down the road. Luciano raised one bloody arm, waving frantically. The car slowed, stopped. A door opened. "Jesus Christ," a voice said. It was a cop, Officer Henry Blanc, though Luciano wouldn't learn the name until later. Blanca took one look at the bloodied man on the road and reached for his radio. "What happened?" Blanca asked, his flashlight revealing the full horror of Luciano's condition. "I was taken for a ride," Luciano managed to say through split lips. Blanca helped him into the patrol car. "Where are you hurt?" "Everywhere," Luciano said, and it wasn't an exaggeration. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to the 123rd Precinct Station House in Tottenville. A doctor from Richmond Memorial Hospital was called. The physician took one look at Luciano and shook his head in amazement. Multiple stab wounds to the back, lacerations across the throat and face, severe contusions on the torso and head. By all rights, this man should have been dead. But he wasn't. As the doctor stitched up Luciano's wounds in a back room at the precinct, Detective Gustav Schley began asking questions, standard procedure for an assault victim, but Luciano's answers were anything but standard. "What's your name?" "Charles Lucania." Schley wrote it down. "Who did this to you?" "I don't know." "You don't know? You're telling me you got no idea who carved you up like a Thanksgiving turkey?" Luciano met the detective's eyes through his swollen eyelids. "I got jumped. I was knocked out. When I woke up, I was on that beach." It was a lie, of course. Luciano knew exactly what had happened, but the code of the streets was absolute. You didn't talk to cops, ever, even if it meant letting your attackers walk free. Because talking to cops meant you were a rat, and rats didn't last long in New York's underworld. "Let me ask you something else," Schley said, changing tactics. "Why'd they leave your valuables? You got a gold watch, a gold chain, $300 in your underwear. If this was a robbery, they did a pretty poor job." Luciano said nothing. Detective Thomas Tunney arrived from Manhattan, summoned by Schley. Tunney knew who Charles Lucania was, knew about his arrests for possession of narcotics, larceny, and various other charges that never seemed to stick. Knew about his associates, Legs Diamond, Fatty Walsh, Meyer Lansky. Knew that Lucania wasn't a victim, he was a player. "Book him," Tunney told Schley. "Book him, he's the victim here." "For his own protection," Tunney said with a thin smile. "Plus, we got an open warrant on an auto theft charge. Might as well make it official." They took Luciano's mugshot. Even through the swelling and bandages, you could see the damage. His right eyelid drooped, the muscles damaged by the beating. Scars ran across his face and down his neck, raw and angry. The camera flash illuminated a man who looked like he'd been through hell. The newspapers picked up the story within hours. "Gangster survives one-way ride. Lucania left for dead on Staten Island beach." The press ate it up, transforming a brutal attempted murder into a sensational tale of underworld intrigue. But something interesting happened in the coverage. Reporters kept referring to Luciano by a nickname he'd carried since his teenage years, a tattoo he'd gotten at 13 that read, "Lucky." The press latched onto the irony. How lucky did you have to be to survive an attack like that? The nickname that had come from youthful bravado now took on new meaning. Charles Lucania had become Lucky Luciano, and the legend was born. 12 days later, Luciano appeared before a grand jury in St. George. District Attorney Albert Fach pressed him for details. Who attacked him? Why? Who ordered it? Luciano stuck to his story. He didn't remember. He was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, his attackers were gone. "You're telling me you have no idea who did this?" Falk asked, incredulous. "That's what I'm telling you," Luciano replied calmly. The case went nowhere. With no cooperation from the victim, no witnesses, and no evidence beyond the injuries themselves, there was nothing to prosecute. Luciano walked out of the courthouse a free man. But he wasn't free. Not really. Because somewhere out there were 4 men who'd left him for dead. And Lucky Luciano had a long memory. 3 days after his court appearance, Luciano sat in a private room above a Mulberry Street restaurant, surrounded by the men he trusted most. Meyer Lansky was there, the mathematical genius who could calculate odds and angles like a chess master. Frank Costello, smooth and political, connected to Tammany Hall judges and corrupt cops. And Bugsy Siegel, whose baby face hid a ruthless killer's instinct. "So who was it?" Lansky asked, lighting a cigarette. Luciano touched the bandage on his neck gingerly. The wounds were healing, but slowly. "That's the question, ain't it?" "Maranzano makes sense," Costello offered. "You're Masseria's guy. Taking you out weakens Joe the boss." "Maybe," Luciano said. "Or maybe it was Joe's people. Maybe he thought I was getting too big, making too many moves on my own." Siegel leaned forward. "So, what are we doing about it?" "We need to hit somebody. Show them you can't be touched." It was the expected response. The old way. Someone tries to kill you, you kill them back. You kill their families. You burn their businesses to the ground. You send a message written in blood that everyone in the city can read. But Luciano shook his head slowly. "That's what they expect," he said quietly. "That's what everyone does. Tit for tat. Blood for blood. You know where that gets you? It gets you a coffin or a prison cell." Lansky smiled. He'd known Lucky long enough to recognize that look. "You got something else in mind?" "Yeah, I do." Luciano stood, walking to the window that overlooked the narrow street below. "They wanted information about Leg's diamond. That's what they kept asking about. Which means this wasn't personal. It was business. Somebody needed Legs, and they thought I could give him up." "So?" Siegel asked. "So we let them think they scared me. We let them think Lucky Luciano learned his lesson and is keeping his head down." Luciano turned back to face them. "Meanwhile, I'm making phone calls. I'm having conversations. I'm letting both Maranzano and Masseria know that I'm a guy who can be useful, who can bring people together instead of starting wars." "You're playing both sides," Costello said, understanding dawning. "I'm playing the long game," Luciano corrected. "These old mustaches, they're dinosaurs. They think the world works the way it did in Sicily 50 years ago. But this is America. This is business. And I'm going to show them there's a better way." Over the next weeks, Luciano did exactly what he'd promised. He reached out to contacts in both camps. He brokered small deals, resolved petty disputes, positioned himself as a valuable intermediary. To Masseria, he played the loyal soldier, still recovering from a mysterious attack but ready to serve. To Maranzano's people, he sent subtle signals through trusted intermediaries. He wasn't Joe the boss's lapdog. He was his own man, thinking about the future. And then Luciano made his most calculated move. He started a rumor. The rumor was simple. Lucky Luciano knew who'd ordered his beating, and he dealt with them quietly, personally, without making a big show of it. The bodies would never be found. The families would never know. But the men who'd left him for dead on that beach, they'd learned the hard way that you don't cross Lucky Luciano and walk away. It wasn't true. Luciano never found out with certainty who'd ordered the hit. Later, he would tell interviewers it was corrupt cops looking for Leg's diamond. Other accounts suggested Maranzano's men. The truth remained murky. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the legend. What mattered was that every gangster in New York heard the story and believed it. Lucky Luciano had survived a one-way ride and somehow, impossibly, made his attackers disappear without a trace, without public bloodshed, without police attention. The message was clear. This man was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with guns or knives. He was dangerous because he was smart. 6 months after the attack, Salvatore Maranzano requested a meeting with Lucky Luciano. It took place in a Bronx restaurant, private room, no weapons allowed. Maranzano sat at the head of a long table, flanked by his lieutenants. Luciano entered alone, his scars still visible but fading, his drooping eye a permanent reminder of that October night. "Sit, Charlie," Maranzano said, gesturing to a chair. Luciano sat. "You know why you're here?" Maranzano asked in Sicilian. "You tell me," Luciano replied in English. Maranzano switched to English, a small concession. "This war with Masseria, it's bad for business. Too much heat, too many bodies. The cops are cracking down. Even the politicians we own are getting nervous." "So end it," Luciano said simply. "It's not that simple. Joe the boss, he's stubborn, old school. He won't negotiate, won't compromise." Maranzano leaned forward. "But you, Charlie, you're different. You're a modern thinker. You understand business. What do you want?" "I want you to help me end this war. Not on Joe's terms, not on mine. On terms that make sense for everyone." Maranzano's eyes were cold, calculating. "I'm told you're a man who can make things happen." This was the moment. The opportunity Luciano had been positioning himself for. Maranzano was essentially asking him to betray Masseria, to help orchestrate the boss's death and restructure the New York mob under a new system. "What's in it for me?" Luciano asked. "A seat at the table," Maranzano said. "Real power, not as somebody's soldier, but as a boss. Your own family, your own territory. A say in how we run things going forward." Luciano stood, walked to the window, looked out at the Bronx street below. This was bigger than revenge. Bigger than the men who'd tried to kill him. This was about reshaping the entire underworld. "You got a deal," Luciano said, turning back to face Maranzano. "But I got conditions." "Name them." "When this is done, we don't run things the old way. No more boss of bosses. No more one guy making all the decisions. We set up a commission, 5 families, equal votes, democratic." Maranzano's face tightened. "That's not how. That's how it's going to be," Luciano interrupted. "Or you can fight this war for another 5 years and watch the whole thing collapse. Your choice." The room went silent. Maranzano's lieutenants tensed, hands moving toward hidden weapons. But Maranzano raised a hand, stopping them. "You got balls, Charlie. I'll give you that." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Okay. We'll talk about your commission after we deal with Joe." "Good," Luciano said. "Then we got an understanding." He walked out of that restaurant knowing Maranzano was lying. The old Sicilian had no intention of sharing power. He'd use Luciano to eliminate Masseria, then try to set himself up as the supreme boss, which meant Luciano would need to move first. But that was a problem for another day. The Castellamarese War ended in blood, as these things always did. Joe Masseria was killed in a Coney Island restaurant on April 15th, 1931. Luciano was with him, but conveniently stepped into the bathroom when the shooters arrived. Within months, Maranzano declared himself boss of bosses and began plotting to eliminate his rivals, including Lucky Luciano. Maranzano never got the chance. On September 10, 1931, 4 men posing as federal agents walked into Maranzano's office and shot him dead. Luciano, always one step ahead, had hired Jewish gunmen that Maranzano's guards wouldn't recognize as threats. In the aftermath, Luciano did exactly what he'd promised in that Bronx restaurant. He reorganized New York's mob into 5 families. He created the Commission, a governing body where disputes would be resolved through votes and discussion, rather than automatic bloodshed. He turned organized crime from a collection of warring gangs into a national syndicate. The story of the October 1929 attack spread through the underworld like wildfire, growing with each retelling. Some said Lucky had killed his attackers with his bare hands. Others claimed he'd had them fed to sharks. The truth, that he'd simply survived and outthought everyone, was less dramatic but far more impressive. Years later, when reporters asked about that night, Luciano would give different answers. Sometimes he said it was Maranzano's men. Sometimes he said it was corrupt cops. Once, he claimed he couldn't remember at all. The mystery added to the legend. But the lesson was clear to everyone in organized crime. Lucky Luciano wasn't dangerous because he was tough. He was dangerous because when someone tried to kill him, his response wasn't revenge. It was revolution. The scars on his face, the drooping eye, the knife wounds on his back. They all became symbols of survival and intelligence triumphing over brute force. Every time a gangster saw Lucky's face, they were reminded that the smartest move isn't always the most violent one. Because Lucky Luciano understood something most gangsters never learn. True power doesn't come from being the toughest guy in the room. It comes from being the smartest. When those 4 men left him bleeding on a Staten Island beach, they thought they'd eliminated a problem. They'd actually created a legend. See, anyone can pull a trigger. Anyone can drive a knife into someone's back. That's easy. That's the animal part of human nature, the part that lashes out when threatened. But real power, the kind that lasts, comes from controlling that animal instinct. From seeing past the immediate satisfaction of revenge to the bigger picture. Luciano could have gone to war, could have started a bloodbath hunting for his attackers. And maybe he would have found them. Maybe he would have killed them all. And then what? Their friends would have come after him. Their families would have wanted revenge. The cycle would continue until everyone was dead or in prison. Instead, he turned an attempted murder into a calling card. He transformed weakness into strength. He made his enemies wonder what he was capable of if he could survive that attack and not retaliate in the expected way. That uncertainty, that fear of the unknown, was more powerful than any bullet. It's a lesson that applies far beyond the underworld. When someone tries to destroy you, the natural impulse is to strike back immediately. But sometimes the smarter move is to step back, analyze the situation, and ask yourself, what do I really want? Short-term satisfaction or long-term success? Luciano wanted to change the game entirely, and he did. October 17th, 1929. A bloodied gangster staggers off a Staten Island beach, more dead than alive. His attackers disappear into the night, convinced they've eliminated a threat. But Charles Lucania survived. And in surviving, he became Lucky Luciano, the man who would reshape organized crime in America. The man who proved that intelligence beats violence. The man whose scars told a story more powerful than any weapon. If this story showed you that the smartest move isn't always the most obvious one, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more stories about the brilliant strategists of organized crime who understood that real power comes from thinking 3 steps ahead. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have gone for immediate revenge or played the long game like Lucky did? What would you have done differently? Turn on notifications because next week we're diving into the night Meyer Lansky walked into a room with $5 million in cash and no protection, stared down the most dangerous men in America, and made them all agree to his terms. How did he do it? The answer involves 0 bullets and one brilliant psychological trick that modern negotiators still use today. Remember, anyone can start a war. It takes a genius to restructure an entire criminal empire while everyone else is busy fighting. Lucky Luciano didn't just survive. He evolved. And that's why, more than 90 years later, we're still talking about the man who walked off that beach.